Well, right now, I've asked Juian Robertson what his outlook is today.
You're in for some real rough sledding. I don't know quite how it's going to come about. I really do think the recession is at least temporarily over, but we haven't addressed so many of our problems, and we are borrowing so much money that we can't possibly pay it back unless the Chinese and Japanese buy our bonds. We've seen what's happening to the dollar. It's, I think, the lowest point of the year right now. And I think it's tragic that we've let ourselves be put in this position by our leadership, who seems afraid to tell the people that we have problems, that we've got to quit spending, cut back, start saving, and scale backward. And until that happens, I don't think we're anywhere near out of the woods.
Some of the optimists out there say, well, the savings rate has gone up, and we had an increase actually in income in this country. Now, that was due in part to the increase in the stock market. And maybe even though we fell off a cliff, we're actually going to come back and we're going to be okay. And it sounds like you think that that optimistic scenario is missing something pretty crucial.
Well, I think that it's almost Armageddon if the Chinese and Japanese don't buy our debt. I don't know where we could get the money. I think we've let ourselves get in a terrible situation, and I think we ought to try to get out of it.
Do you think we can grow our way out of it?
I think we can grow and save our way out of it. And I think that's the only way we're going to have that threat removed. I wonder what some of the congressmen who have been so upset about financial leaders, I wonder what they think of the leadership of the country that's permitted these very speculative policies. I mean, it's amazing. And we're totally dependent now on the Chinese and Japanese.
What is a bigger risk right now, inflation or deflation?
I think we can't deflate too much. I mean, our interest rates aren't terribly high. And so I think inflation is very high. I mean, I think that risk is much worse.
So one of your biggest bets when we spoke last was betting on inflation going higher, and Bill Gross was on with you, and he said, well, maybe we could go to 6 or 7%, and you said that would be conservative. What do you think now?
Well, I think if the Chinese and Japanese stop buying our bonds, we could easily see 15 to 20. And I think that there are people, I mean, where is the money going to come from? It's not a question of the economy. It's a question of who will lend us the money if they don't. Imagine us getting ourselves in the situation where we're totally dependent on those two countries. It's crazy.
Do you think there's a real risk? Some people say, well, gosh, if China stops and the U.S. fails, they fail too, so it's this sort of embrace.
That is the general feeling. I think that is exactly the general feeling. And I don't think that the Chinese do want to stop buying our bonds, but I do think there are circumstances that could cause them to have to.
So if you had to say that the most important thing the United States could do to either stop borrowing or pay it back more quickly, or just some way to get out of this, what do you see? I
think that my solution does cause some temporary pain in America, and I think that the only way we're going to get that is for the American people to be masochistic enough to ask for that, because we can be sure that the politicians are not going to ask that of us. Mrs. Thatcher had enough guts to do that, but we don't seem to be willing to ask sacrifices of really anybody here except our military, and I think that's sort of tragic.
And how much longer could the pain last? I know you had mentioned at one point that if we don't get it right, it could be 10 or 15 years.
Well, I think that the Chinese, Japanese not buying our bonds really could be terrible. I mean, really, and it could. I mean, well, let's look at Japan. They're probably entering their 19th recessionary year in a row. It's even conceivable. I don't think the Chinese would do this, but the Japanese suffer from some of the same problems we have. They may be forced to sell some of their long-term bonds.
So not even a political statement, just forced to do it.
Forced to do it, and you know, if they sell them, I mean, that's much worse than not buying.
So I'm sure you've thought of every scenario. They buy as much as they're buying now, they buy a little bit less, they start selling, right? There's all sorts of different things that could happen. What do you think is the most realistic one? I mean, we've seen some of the recent data. China hasn't been buying as much as they had been.
Well, the other thing is they're buying almost exclusively short-term debt. And that's what we're offering because we can't sell the long-term debt, I think. And, you know, the history has been that people who borrow short-term really get burned. I mean, that's the beginning kind of the end. So I think that's very serious.
In terms of where we go from here, what are the odds? If you had to say, I'm going to make a bet on the U.S. economy.
We still haven't attacked the problem, and unless we attack the problem, we're not going to get out of it. And the problem is stimulating, which is another synonym for spend, and borrow to pay for the spend. And we can't get out of it unless we stop.
Do you think we're moving in the right direction of stopping? I mean, even if you're skeptical about savings rates, let's just say they've gone up to 5 to 6% from zero.
No, they've gone up to about 12, I think. They've really gone up. I mean, there's no question. I mean, and that has, you know, ameliorated the situation.
But you think we need more, and we need to not be borrowing so much?
Well, if what I'm talking about, if the Chinese are taken out of the equation, it would overwhelm our savings. Then you'd have to have more savings. And if you took it up to 20 and 25%, that would probably, hurt the economy because it'd be not much disposable income to get rid of.